This is my review of the Apco Paramotor Pod. I've had the pod for about a full winter flying season, and I've gone back and forth between using it and not using it throughout the season. I put a total of about 35 hours on the pod, and I feel fairly qualified to give you the information that I wish that I had before I purchased the pod. In this video, we're going to start with a basic overview of what the pod is and the claims that Apco makes about it. Then we're going to address some of the performance claims, specifically speed and aerodynamics. Then we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of the pod, and then end with a summary of my concluding thoughts about the pod. The short version is I like the pod for winter flying, but hate it for just about everything else. But let's start out with just a basic description of the pod. Basically, the pod is a fairing that goes over your legs and lower body. It's kind of modeled after the first third of a paraglider pod harness. Now, I say the first third because I think that's an important caveat for both winter comfort and for aerodynamics. You don't have any side fairing, and obviously you don't have the back fairing, which is significant when it comes to paraglider pod harness efficiency. Now, the claims that Apco makes about it is they say, and this is directly from their website, they say that it's a desirable upgrade for winter flying or any cross-country pilot looking for an edge in comfort, speed, and aerodynamics. They say that it's universal and that it fits most harnesses. And this is good and bad. It means that it should fit just about any harness, but it's bad because it's not optimized for any specific harness necessarily. They also say that it's weatherproof and that it's constructed from a zero porosity elastic material. They say that it's Speedbar compatible and that it is damn cool. So we're gonna address some of those claims. Let's start by just talking about the overall construction of the pod. When I first got the pod, I was actually pleasantly surprised by its construction. Now, I got the pod from Sky Sports USA. I think if you're in the United States, the cheapest you can do is through Aerolite, because they offer free shipping. However, when I went to order from them, they didn't have any in stock. When I ordered from Sky Sports USA, it shipped the same day that I made the order, actually within a couple hours. So let's take a look at the construction of the pod overall. So first of all, the thing that I was most impressed by was the material in general. It's this non-permeable but very stretchy material, which means that it should be able to accommodate most pilots while also minimizing wrinkles, so that it gives you the best aerodynamic effect. It's obviously a very high quality material here. Then you have a zip to enclose the pod once you get into the pod. Now, one thing that's really neat and necessary is they have this very strong magnet that has kind of a clasp to hold this upper part together so that you can zip it. Very nice thought, works perfectly. At the bottom, you have a footboard, and this is just a piece of, probably plywood that your feet go on, and then a variety of straps to get it adjusted just how you like for your height and for your desired foot position. Overall, I was really impressed with the construction quality of the pod. On the leading edge of the pod here, you have kind of a stiffener rod to give it its shape, and then this hole. And basically what happens is as you're flying, the airstream goes into this hole and pressurizes this front fairing, and it actually seems to do a pretty good job. From a third-person perspective, you can definitely tell that this part of the pod is getting inflated. Now, actually, let's talk about the bottom too. So the bottom is has this nice opening, and then it has these strong magnets that basically just close automatically once you put your feet in there. Does actually a surprisingly good job of sealing off any airflow. I mean, I really can't feel any air once it's all completely covered up. But let's talk about a couple of issues that I do have with the kind of design of the pod. First of all, with this Dudek power seat comfort, since it does have an extremely long seat board, one issue that you have is that you actually don't get to the end of the opening of where the pod is completely, because some of it's restricted by the seat board of the harness itself, which means that the actual the size of that opening hole to get your feet in when you first put the paramotor on your back is actually kind of small. I don't really think there's anything that Apco could do about that, because You know, if it was any longer, then it would just be a stupid long pod and it wouldn't fit me. So I don't really know what to say about that, except for it's just a little bit of a hassle to get into. The other issue that I had was how Apco recommends connecting the pod for launch is they have these magnets. Basically, you attach this magnet to your chest strap, and then it connects to this the magnet that connects to the seat board. The problem is especially with a front container reserve, that tends to put too much pressure on the leading edge of the pod here, and it comes unstuck. So what I've done is I've actually attached a plastic buckle in lieu of that magnet, and that actually works great. Now we're going to talk about those performance claims that you would expect and that Apco makes. Now, the exact claim that Apco makes is that this pod gives you an edge in comfort, speed, and aerodynamics. So let's start with speed, because I think that's kind of the throwaway one. Personally, this claim isn't even plausible to me. Basically, what I think a reasonable person would expect this pod to do is to reduce drag. And if drag is an opposing force to thrust, we all know as paramotor pilots that when you increase thrust or reduce drag, you improve your climb rate, not speed. The only way that I can see this pod actually improving speed is if you are flying a glider engine combination where you cannot maintain level flight when fully accelerated. If adding the pod reduces drag enough to now you can maintain fully accelerated level flight, then in a way that increases your cruise speed, although technically it wouldn't even increase your actual speed. You could have maintained that speed before, you'd just be descending, now you can maintain level flight. Personally, if that is what they meant by the claim, I would call that a aerodynamics claim, not a speed claim. I wasn't even gonna test this claim because it's so implausible to me, but I did test it and what I found was no effect. I'm not really gonna go into that in any more detail. So let's talk about the claim of improved aerodynamics. Now this is the one that actually seemed pretty plausible to me. You'd expect adding this fairing that would probably reduce drag. Now I wanna start off by saying it's not necessarily a given that you're definitely gonna reduce drag by a lot. Obviously you reduce drag by adding a fairing, so it would be probably more aerodynamically efficient, but you're also adding a lot of surface area that air has to go by. You increase what's called skin friction drag. The skin friction area of my legs is much less than the skin friction area of all of this material. Another thing is, since it's not faired to the sides, you create a very low pressure area exactly where that pod terminates, and you can even feel it when you're flying it. You can feel the airflow coming in from the side of the pod to this low pressure area immediately behind the pod. It's not 100% a given that you have the improved aerodynamics, but it's definitely plausible. So I wanted to test that. I think there's a few things that you would expect from a drag reduction. Probably the most obvious is you'd expect to see a reduction in cruise RPM, which would be awesome because you'd see better fuel economy, less engine wear, less noise. Win-win-win. Probably less obvious is you should also expect to see an improvement in full power climb rate, and probably also obvious is a better glide. Now let's talk about that climb rate. Basically, climb rate is a function of excess thrust. So if this is the thrust you have available and this is the thrust required, or let's say drag, thrust required equals drag in unaccelerated flight. This margin is your climb rate. If you can increase the margin by either increasing power or reducing drag, then you increase climb rate. So in this case, you don't expect to increase the thrust available, but you do expect to reduce the thrust required, resulting in a better climb rate. Similarly, if your thrust available becomes zero, this is now your negative climb rate or descent rate. So if your descent rate is like this without the pod, and now your thrust required, or drag, goes down, now the magnitude of that descent rate goes down. So in short, you should expect to see both a reduction in cruise RPM, an improvement in climb rate, and also a lower descent rate. Unfortunately, what I found was basically no effect in all three of those. For the comparison, I had to have a few different control conditions. The first control condition was with the pod installed, but with my legs down, just like how most people normally fly. I tried to tuck in the pod as best as I can, but decided not to remove it between trials, basically because it was more important to me to be testing the same atmosphere back to back than it was to test with and without the pod installed. I figured if anything, this would slightly advantage the aerodynamics of the pod test condition, but that it should be pretty negligible. So this was the test condition with the legs down. The next test condition was with the pod still stowed, but with my legs up, with my toes pointed. And this served two purposes: to try to be as aerodynamic as possible without the advantage of the pod, and also to control for a change in thrust angle. So this is my parallel plane with my legs down. With my legs up, it moves that to be a little bit more vertical. So it's supposed to control for that condition. And then finally, test condition 3 was with my legs up and in the pod. And I'll demonstrate getting into the pod here, just for the sake of demonstration. So basically this is what I did. Set up the pod, make sure that the side fairings were pulled back to give it as aerodynamic of an effect as possible. Then zipper up and go for my trials. So now let's get to the actual results. So I made some tables. This is what I actually used when I was flying to record the data as I was flying. The first day was it turned out to be a little bit bumpier than I wanted, so I didn't really use the data there, but it really showed it showed the same result. Basically what I got was the differences within the same test condition was at least as big as the difference between different test conditions. In other words, any effect size was at least as big as the margin of error. So I have a hard time saying that there is actually an effect. However, on my second trial, which the conditions were a little bit better, I consider them to be a little bit, these results to be a little bit more valid than my first one. I did find when you average the two trials, I did 2 trials of each test condition, I found that my legs down, and I'll include the raw data in the description or maybe somewhere in this video here. But basically what I found was the legs down climb rate, 378 feet per minute, legs up climb, 381 feet per minute, legs in the pod climb, 385 feet per minute. So legs down to legs in the pod gave me a grand improvement of 7 feet per minute, which for a 1,000-foot climb, that was a difference of 3 seconds. 3 seconds is less than a 2% performance improvement. And then similarly, legs down climb 400 feet per minute, legs up glide 394 feet per minute, pod glide 388 feet per minute. So there's a 12 foot per minute descent rate difference. This is a 3% difference. It's kind of something, but not really. As far as I'm concerned, the margin of error was at least as big as any effect size. I don't really feel comfortable saying that there definitely was an effect. I think that it's too small to be worth really anything. I was really disappointed by that. I was really hoping to see at least a few hundred RPM difference. I do want to kind of, as an aside, say that it's really important that if you actually care about the numbers, and I don't care if you don't, this is just a fun hobby thing, like who really cares? But if you care about the numbers, I think it's really important to do trials like this because there were times where I'm just like cruising around with the pod. My Hadron normally cruises at about 7,200 RPM on my Atom. There were times where I'm cruising and I'm doing like 7,000 RPM. And I'm like, holy cow, this is actually, definitely better. Like I can tell that there's a difference. But then I look at my Vario and then a minute later I see, I've actually descended 50 feet. So I wasn't actually maintaining level flight, I was in a slow descent. It's really easy to be fooled by what you want to see. If you care about the numbers, it's important to do the actual tests in as controlled of a way as you can. That's just my aside. I hope that this data is good. Actually, I don't. I really would like there to be an effect, but I couldn't find one. If you've done similar tests or found some error in my methodology, I would love to hear it, and I would love to try it again, but as far as I can tell, no effect, unfortunately. So now we're going to talk about what is by far the best aspect of this pod, and that is how wind impermeable it is. It completely blocks wind to your legs, feet, and much of your lower body. And this is a big deal to me, and I'll show you why. This is everything that I have to wear in the winter time in order to be at least moderately comfortable in temperatures down to about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And it sucks. I hate it. I hate winter flying because of how bulky and encumbered you feel. In fact, the total weight of all of these clothes, just the clothes that I wear for flying in the wintertime, is 15.5 pounds of clothes. So obviously you can imagine this would be very uncomfortable to have to wear 15 pounds of clothes just to be moderately comfortable in the wintertime. Now by comparison, you might not really be able to tell much of a difference on my pod winter flying clothes. It's still a ton of clothes, but I can do away with my really bulky, thick flying suit and go for just adding a windbreaker and some very lightweight snow pants. So the weight of these clothes now is 11.8 pounds, which means that I save, about 3.5 pounds of clothes. But it's not just the weight, it's really the bulk. While this 5-layer flight suit is very warm, it is also really thick material, very bulky, and just really restricts your movement enough to make it, really detract from the flying experience quite a lot, in my opinion. Now again, I've gone back and forth quite a few times on this, thinking, well, maybe that bulky flying suit is fine if I don't have to use the pod, which is, kind of cumbersome in and of itself. But then I just keep finding myself coming back to using the pod because I really do like being able to wear the lighter weight snow pants. It makes launch easier. If there's no snow, I can wear gym shoes instead of heavier winter boots. It really is a very close compromise, but in my opinion, having the pod and being able to therefore wear slightly fewer or at least lighter weight winter flying clothes makes a big difference for me and slightly edges out over having to wear, thicker, more restrictive clothing. Now we're going to talk about the cons. Now I think that this is the one that I most expected coming into it, which is to say the hassle of getting into the pod, especially when you're already so bundled up with your winter flying clothes. So you really have to just kind of fish around down here for the opening with your feet. Okay, then get in there and kind of lean back to get into the shoulders here. Okay, then get all your buckles done with. Okay, you have all your buckles, get your reserve. Okay, now comes the issue of trying to figure out what to do with this skirt thing. Now, Apco includes, and it is actually a pretty good design, this little magnet piece, and it's supposed to connect to your center chest strap, and there's a corresponding magnet piece on the leading edge of the pod. And basically the idea is you can connect it up here and you're good to go. The problem is that when you have a front mount reserve like me, it's very easy for that magnet to come detached, even though the magnet itself is pretty strong. The modification that I've made is to just replace that magnet with a plastic buckle and kind of get everything settled, and it works quite well. It's never going to fall off, and pretty easy to unclip once you get in flight. The next con that I have with this pod is if you have a front mount reserve like I do, now very specifically like I do, which is supposed to attach to this lower chest strap. If it's attached to that chest strap, you really can't do it any other way but to have the reserve inside the pod, which is a slight safety issue. I do feel like I can reach the handle. I just have to reach into the pod itself to be able to grab the reserve. I don't think it would be an actual issue, but there would be a slight impediment to response time in getting to the reserve if I had to throw it. Another possible safety issue with the pod is since you are sitting with your legs horizontal, your moment of inertia along the yaw axis is a little bit higher than it normally would be, which means that you're more resistant to any yaw. which might sound good until you take a partial deflation and your glider starts to turn, but you're not turning with it, and now you have a riser twist. It does add a small element of risk, and especially if you're doing, cross country, which is kind of what this is marketed towards, adding, not just the inertia that you have because of your motor, which, free flight pilots don't have, but then on top of that, you have your legs way out, increasing that moment of inertia even more. It does increase the risk of a riser twist and, would make recovery from that just a little bit more difficult. How many of us paramotor pilots are regularly taking deflations? Probably not many of us, but just something to think about. Another issue that I have with the pod from a design perspective is that they don't enclose the side here. And what that means is that you have airflow circulating kind of into your lap. So it took me a few flights of 40-degree weather where I was flying in jeans and I thought that I would be fine, but my upper thighs were just freezing. You still need to wear some sort of at least light snow pant to keep your legs warm enough even with the pod. Finally, the last issue that I have is the ability to recover from a very low level engine failure if you had your legs in the pod. I like to do a lot of low-level slalom type flying. It's probably my favorite thing to do in paramotors, but I just don't do it with my legs in the pod. If I'm using the pod and I find an area that I want to play at, I just stow the pod, get it clipped in, and then play low, and it's no problem. While it's plausible that you could definitely get your legs out if you had a low-level engine failure, you'd still have this skirt, and especially if you're at like foot drag, slalom height, where you have both your hands on the brakes trying to just maneuver to a safe landing, you're not going to be able to lift this to clip it to your chest strap to get that out of the way. So now you have this skirt that's kind of interfering with a full stride that you would almost certainly need to be able to safely run out a low-level engine failure. So just something to consider. That's kind of a big deal to me, but there are workarounds for it, namely just stowing it when you play low. Just keep in mind that those lighter weight clothes that you were wearing because you have the pod are no longer providing you that full benefit because you're not using the pod. I worry that this review may have been a little bit unfairly harsh towards the Apco Universal Paramotor Pod. Even though the negative side effects of using the pod are numerous and sometimes significant, I do think that its use as a wintertime wind blocker is brilliant. For me, being able to wear running shoes instead of heavy boots, and being able to trade a bulky flying suit for light snow pants and a windbreaker is a big deal to me in retaining some level of the feeling of freedom that defines paramotor flight. While I've found myself being envious of others kicking out plumes of powdery snow as they do foot drags through field after field as I'm restricted to the pod's confines, I do enjoy the coziness and warmth of the pod, and will even join in from time to time, although with the pod securely stowed and for only as long as my exposed legs and feet can take it. For me, the Apco Paramotor Pod is a welcome addition to my wintertime machine, although I'd be lying if I said I'm not thrilled to soon be ditching it as the relative springtime warmth makes its use unnecessary. I hope this video has been informative if you're considering the pod. I'll try my best to address any questions or suggestions in the comments. Thank you for watching.